Well now, good evening again, my curious friends. Or perhaps good morning, wherever you may be watching from. I see the fire is crackling just right tonight. So grab your blanket, settle in, and let me pour you another tale from the old chest. Forgotten history. Pause. Do you remember our last story? The chilling rise of Vlad the Impaler, how one man's thirst for vengeance carved his name into the bones of Eastern Europe. It was dark, it was brutal, but as I always say, history doesn't flinch, and neither should we. Inhales deeply. Tonight, we travel to a different kind of horror, not one born of sword and crown, but something silent, something that crept in on the wind. No villains here. At least not ones you can see. Just ships, rats, and a sickness that turned the world upside down. The year was 1347. In the bustling Mediterranean, trade ruled all. Spices from the east, silks from China, incense from Arabia, they all flowed like blood through the arteries of Europe's growing cities. Venice, Genoa, Marseille, and Messina. A port nestled at the northern tip of Sicily. It was small but vital, a waypoint for ships navigating between east and west. The people of Messina were used to travelers. They saw merchants, pilgrims, warriors returning from crusades, and the occasional exile hoping to vanish into the sea's embrace. But that October, something else arrived. It didn't come shouting or waving banners. It came groaning, whispering, shivering through the planks of 12 Genoese ships. Ships that had fled the Black Sea, escaped the Mongol siege at Kaffa, and drifted, half dead, into Sicilian waters. The harbor master, records say, was the first to sense something wrong. There was no cheer from the decks, no eager haggling, just silence, and a stench. When dockhands boarded the vessels, they found horror. Dead men in rows, covered in linen, faces blackened. The living ones weren't far behind. They trembled, vomited, and begged for water. But it wasn't thirst that would kill them. It was the swellings, great pulsing lumps in their groins and underarms, dark as ink and hot as fire. Buboes, they would later be called. The people of Messina recoiled. Some called for the ships to be burned. Others wanted to help. The leaders, perhaps thinking they could contain the sickness, ordered the crews quarantined aboard their vessels. But the disease didn't stay put. You see, dear listeners, the plague was not polite. It didn't wait for permission. It rode in on fleas, nested in rats. And those rats, well, they had no interest in quarantine. They scurried down ropes, vanished into warehouses, into homes, and soon the coughing began. It started with a few, dock workers, then their families, then the priests who came to give them last rites, and then the priests' apprentices. Within a fortnight, Messina was drowning. Imagine, if you will, a city unraveling day by day. The bells of the cathedral, once rung for weddings and mass, now tolled for funerals, until even the bell ringers died. Mothers buried children, husbands buried wives. And when there were no more grave diggers, bodies were tossed into pits and covered with quicklime. The church tried to explain. Some said it was God's wrath, punishment for a sinful world. Others blamed the alignment of planets. A few whispered about foreign poisoners, conspiracies, curses. But the truth was much simpler and much colder. This was biology, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, riding in the blood of fleas, brought on a merchant ship, and spread by the very networks that had made Europe powerful. Trade was the empire's bloodstream, and now it carried death. Let's pause here for a moment, shall we? Because what happened in Messina would repeat again and again. This wasn't a local outbreak. This was a beginning. The Black Death, as we now call it, would reach Genoa, Marseille, and Constantinople within weeks. England and Germany within months. Norway, Iceland, even parts of Asia Minor and North Africa. An estimated 75 to 200 million people would die. Entire villages would vanish. The labor force would collapse. The feudal system, long thought eternal, would crack under the weight of loss. But that is for later chapters. Tonight, we stay with Messina. Let me tell you about an innkeeper. Her name was Lucia, and her family had run the Rosa di Mare Inn for 3 generations. She was known for her honey cakes and lemon wine, a bright soul in a port town. When the ships came, Lucia was among the first to offer water and food to the quarantined sailors. She didn't know. Her kindness was fatal. Within a week, she was coughing. By day 10, she could no longer stand. Her husband carried her to the cathedral, pleading for prayer. By nightfall, both were dead. Their inn burned days later, a desperate attempt by neighbors to cleanse the air. Lucia's story was not unique. It was one of thousands, and soon, tens of thousands. What makes the tale of Messina so haunting is that it was the first, the warning bell that went unheeded. After Messina, other ports began to turn away Genoese ships, but the damage was done. The rats were already ashore, the fleas were biting, the people were dying, and worst of all, the knowledge was not there. Doctors, bless them, did their best. They wore long robes and bird-like masks filled with herbs, hoping to block miasma from reaching their lungs. They lanced buboes, bled patients, burned incense. Nothing worked. Nothing. And that helplessness, that awful certainty that the richest lords and humblest beggars were equally vulnerable, that shook Europe to its core. In Messina, by December 1347, over half the population was dead. Some chronicles say 2/3. The harbor fell silent again. No ships came. The survivors fled inland, bringing the plague with them. The city, once a jewel of Sicilian trade, became a ghost. And yet, from this silence came the first lesson, that no wall is high enough, no gold is safe enough, no title is powerful enough to stop death when it comes by sea, hidden in the shadows. Santa's voice softens again, warm with memory, but edged with sorrow. I tell you this not to frighten, but to remember. The people of Messina weren't fools. They were simply first. And sometimes in history, being first means being forgotten, unless someone somewhere tells your story. Pause. Then gently. Next time, we'll trace the plague's path into France and England. We'll watch how kings, merchants, and peasants tried to fight the invisible. But for now, may your night be peaceful, and may your heart remember Lucia and the city that met the darkness first. The people of Messina believed they could contain the disease. Perhaps they thought it a local curse, an evil wind, something that might pass if ignored. But they didn't see what was hiding beneath their floors, their grain sacks, their beds. They didn't see the real killer. It had whiskers and a tail. The black rat, Rattus rattus, was a common companion to man. They thrived where people lived, fed on what they stored, and nested in their homes. And on their backs, nestled in. Warm fur were fleas. Fleas that carried something far more deadly than anyone could imagine. Inside the gut of a flea, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, multiplied rapidly. So rapidly, in fact, that it clogged the flea's digestive tract. Starving and desperate for food, the infected flea bit harder and more frequently, regurgitating infected blood into its host's skin. It didn't care if the host was rat or man. This was the true mechanism of transmission, the invisible thread stitching. Together, one body to the next, one city to the next, one continent to the next. From Messina, ships fled to escape the dying city. Sailors, believing they could outrun the horror, unknowingly brought it to every port they touched. To Genoa, where guards tried to keep the vessels out, but failed. To Marseille, where the plague erupted within days. To Tunis, across the Mediterranean. where it swept through North Africa, and to Pisa and Venice, where the dead filled churches and canals alike. Every stop along the trade routes opened new veins for the infection to travel. Death followed not in great waves, but as a silent tide that seeped into the cracks of civilization. No one understood what was happening. Doctors still adhered to the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, diagnosing based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They believed illness came from an imbalance within the body or from poisoned air, miasma, rather, than any organism too small to see. Few suspected rats, fewer still suspected fleas. The greatest minds of Europe were blind to the truth skittering across their feet and nesting in their walls. In Avignon, where the Pope resided, fear turned into flame. Bonfires were lit throughout the city in an attempt to purify the air. Streets were scrubbed with vinegar. Bodies were burned in mass cremations. The Pope himself, Clement VI, sat between two roaring fires during ceremonies, hoping the heat would shield him from disease. He survived. Most of his cardinals did not. Out in the countryside, superstition exploded. Animals were blamed. Cats and dogs were slaughtered by the thousands, which ironically gave the rats even greater freedom to breed. Accusations flew of sorcery, of well poisoning, of divine retribution. Panic is a kindling that burns rationality to ash, and it burned fast. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio watched his city descend into madness and death. He wrote that people died so quickly and in such numbers that bodies were left in doorways, on staircases, in alleys. So many corpses piled up that burial became impossible. Entire households vanished in a matter of days. In his preface to the Decameron, he described how buboes the size of apples or eggs appeared on the body, and how, once they emerged, death was usually swift. In Paris, the University of Paris issued a formal report explaining the plague as the result of a rare triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius. This alignment, they claimed, had corrupted the air and created a pestilential fog. Their findings were circulated throughout Europe, further entrenching the belief that the sickness was airborne and mystical. Meanwhile, real carriers, rats, continued to thrive. In England, the first signs of the plague came with a shipwreck. A Gascon vessel washed ashore near Dorset, its crew infected. From there, the disease fanned out. Bristol, Winchester, London. It moved along roads, inside carts of cloth and wine, between monasteries and merchant houses. Londoners tried to act. Quarantines were declared. Pits were dug. Prayers echoed across the Thames. But it wasn't enough. By the end of the year, more than half the city had perished. There were no hospitals prepared for this, no systems, no leadership that could respond meaningfully. In towns where disease erupted, local governments crumbled. Mayors and magistrates fled or died. Clergy who stayed behind died performing last rites. In their absence, fear ruled. Families abandoned one another. Parents refused to bury their own children. In some cases, people looted the dead, thinking the sickness couldn't touch them if they were fast and clever. Some cities tried radical measures. Milan ordered the homes of infected individuals to be sealed entirely, with the sick and their families still inside. It was brutal, but effective. Milan suffered fewer losses than most major cities. Venice, known for its maritime vigilance, began experimenting with isolation. Ships arriving in port were held offshore for 40 giorni, 40 days. Thus the word quarantine was born. It was a primitive solution, but one that hinted at future public health innovations. The disease did not stay in one form. In some regions, it morphed. It entered the lungs and became pneumonic plague, spread by cough and breath. In others, it went into the blood directly, turning it black, septicemic plague. In these cases, death came not in days, but in hours. There was no warning, no salvation, no comfort. Trade, the lifeblood of the medieval world, had become the artery of death. And yet trade continued. The economy depended on it. Merchants took the risk, pilgrims crossed borders, letters still traveled between courts, and with them, so did plague. No matter how many cities closed gates or lit purifying fires, the web of commerce proved too vast to unravel. Every town was connected, every city vulnerable. The rats did not understand borders, nor did the fleas understand language or faith. They moved where the food was, where the warmth was, where people lived, and where they moved, plague followed. It is easy now to blame ignorance, to mock the masks, the fire pits, the bleeding and leeching and prayers. But we must remember, there was no microscope, no germ theory, no antibiotics. Humanity was fighting an invisible enemy with superstition and hope. And yet even in devastation, some lessons began to take root. Observations spread. That proximity to the dead increased risk. That travel accelerated the outbreak. That isolation could protect. In the void left by the dead, survivors started asking questions. Real questions. The seeds of modern medicine, though buried in ash and sorrow, were beginning to sprout. By the time the calendar turned to 1349, Europe was firmly in the grip of the Black Death. But the questions remained unanswered. What had caused this horror? Was it punishment or accident? Was there a cure or only despair? The people did not yet know. All they knew was that the world had changed, and that nothing, not even the silence of the church or the comfort of home, could keep the plague from knocking on the door. Messina had seen sickness before. Malaria in the summer months, fevers from spoiled water, even outbreaks of dysentery during war. But nothing prepared the people of this Sicilian port for what crept in that autumn of 1347. The city was alive, with trade, bursting with markets, echoing with voices from every corner of the Mediterranean. It was a place of merchants and monks, fishermen and foreigners. Life here moved fast, with goods changing hands as swiftly as gossip. But within days of the Genoese ship's arrival, that rhythm cracked. At first, the symptoms seemed strange but not unprecedented. Dock workers developed fevers. Sailors complained of chills and dizziness. Some collapsed at the harbor, others in nearby inns. Then came the swelling. Large, painful lumps forming beneath the arms in the groin. Black, hot to the touch, pulsing, with something no healer could draw out. People whispered of poison, cursed cargo, or Eastern spirits stowed away in the spice crates. None of it made sense. And worse, nothing stopped it. The city's leaders moved quickly, by medieval standards. The ships were quarantined, or as close to quarantined as 14th century understanding allowed. Guards were posted. Some ships were pushed back to sea. But it was already too late. The rats had left the holds. The fleas had found new hosts. The plague was no longer in the port. It was in the streets. Within the first week, 20 died. Within the second, nearly 100. The dead were poor, mostly. Sailors, laborers, servants. At first, the wealthy didn't worry. They believed their stone houses and private wells would shield them. But death did not respect class. A merchant's wife fell ill after visiting a local bakery. A magistrate's son died after sharing a meal with a friend who'd helped unload cargo. Fear spread faster than the disease, and that too proved fatal. Funerals were short, if held at all. Churches overflowed with bodies. Some priests refused to enter infected homes. Others went inside and never came out again. The Bishop of Messina was said to have led a procession through the streets with a relic in hand, chanting prayers to drive the plague away. 3 days later, he was dead. The graveyards filled so quickly that pits were dug behind churches. Then, in the fields. Then along the roads. Bodies were carted out at night to avoid panic. The smell became unbearable. Ash was spread. Lime was poured. But there were simply too many to bury and too few left to bury them. By November, Messina had lost nearly a third of its population. Panic drove some to violence. Foreigners were accused of bringing the sickness. Jewish traders in particular were blamed, beaten, stoned, expelled. Their homes burned. Others turned inward, believing the end of the world had come. Doomsday preachers marched barefoot through the town, crying of wrath and judgment. Some residents joined self-flagellating cults, hoping their suffering might appease divine anger, and still the bodies piled up. A woman named Serafina, a midwife known across the port for delivering hundreds of babies, was among the last to offer care to the dying. She wrapped buboes in vinegar-soaked cloth, prayed over the infected, and sang lullabies to children whose parents had already succumbed. Her house became a hospice, but even she couldn't hold the disease at bay. One morning, she was found, curled beside the body of a child she'd tended, eyes closed, skin marked by the unmistakable black boils of plague. As December drew near, the survivors began to flee. Caravans left under cover of darkness, horses stolen, boats launched without preparation. But those who escaped carried the disease with them, into the mountains, into the villages, across the sea. Messina had become a warning, a cursed name on the lips of sailors. But most ports didn't listen, or couldn't. Trade had to continue. Crops had to move. Soldiers needed to travel. The machinery of medieval life could not be stopped, even when death sat in the passenger's seat. One scribe, who lived through it, wrote simply, "Where there had been laughter, there is now only coughing. Where there were songs, there is silence." Messina breathes no more. And yet the plague was not done with the city. The disease returned in waves, pulsing through the population every few months as new ships docked, as old survivors gathered, as food supplies ran out, and desperation returned. By the end of winter, Messina was no longer a city. It was a shell. Of its estimated 40,000 residents, more than 25,000 had died. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Vine-covered homes, shuttered shops, collapsed roofs. The once busy port fell quiet. Trade ceased. Bells stopped ringing. The church itself closed its doors. Survivors called it a judgment. Chroniclers called it divine fire. But in truth, it was just the first breath of a disaster that would smother an entire continent. Messina's tragedy echoed outward. Its fall marked the beginning of a nightmare for Europe, but also a shift, one that would change how people understood death, medicine, society itself. But those lessons would take time, decades even. In the moment, all anyone could do was run, bury, pray. There was no cure, no protection, no hope, just the rats, the fleas, and the slow collapse of a world that had no defenses for what it didn't understand. Messina was only the beginning. The plague, once ashore, didn't linger in one place. It moved, not randomly, but with direction, carried by ships, by merchants, by markets. What looked like chaos was, in truth, terrifyingly efficient. The bar, very arteries that connected Europe's cities, the same routes that had fueled the Renaissance, spread knowledge, and made fortunes, now delivered death with the same precision. Every port became a point of infection. Every road a corridor of collapse. From Messina, Genoese ships set sail, some desperately seeking refuge, others simply continuing their trade. They reached Sicily's neighboring ports, Palermo, Catania, and then the mainland of Italy. In late 1347, a fleet docked at Genoa. The reaction was swift, but too late. The city, one of Europe's most vibrant trade hubs, ordered the ships away. But the rats had already disembarked. Death had already begun its climb through narrow alleys and crowded tenements. Venice was next. The lagoon city, built on water, surrounded by walls and watchtowers, believed itself immune to invasions of every kind. And yet, when the disease arrived, it flowed through the canals just as easily as the tide. Ships from the east brought spices and silks, and with them, corpses. The city instituted early quarantine efforts, placing arriving ships on nearby islands like Lazaretto Vecchio. But even those who waited the required days sometimes disembarked symptom-free, only to fall ill and spread the sickness days later. Quarantine was an idea, but not yet a science. Marseille, too, fell quickly. A bustling French port, it received goods and death from Genoese vessels. The outbreak in Marseille was explosive. Entire neighborhoods were emptied in weeks. The sick overflowed the Hôtel Dieu, the main hospital. Doctors died treating patients. Priests fled. Local leaders collapsed under the weight of burial and sanitation demands. By early 1348, Marseille was losing hundreds a day, as the plague. Moved inland, it followed the rivers and roads. The Rhône and the Loire became black veins through which infection pulsed into the heart of France. Merchants unknowingly carried more than just cloth and coin. They carried the flea. Mules and carts spread it deeper. Inns passed it from traveler to traveler. The same systems that once brought Europe prosperity now accelerated its devastation. By spring, it had reached Paris. The university debated causes while the dead piled high in the streets. King Philip VI, though relatively protected, lost friends, courtiers, and servants. He ordered public prayers and processions, but the heavens remained silent. Rumors said that even the Seine itself had turned foul. In Spain, the disease traveled both by sea and by foot. From Barcelona to Valencia and across the Pyrenees, communities began to crumble. The Spanish monarchs issued decrees to close ports, but enforcement was patchy and bribes flowed. Farmers stopped bringing produce to towns. Grain shipments rotted in harbors. Hunger became plague's accomplice. North Africa, too, was not spared. From Tunis and Alexandria to Fez and Algiers, the disease struck Muslim communities with equal force. Islamic scholars, like their Christian counterparts, searched for meaning. Some interpreted it as a cleansing trial. Others saw it as punishment. Many simply died without answer. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, fared no better. A cosmopolitan city bridging Europe and Asia, it received ships from everywhere. When plague entered the city, it struck with terrifying precision, nobles and beggars alike. The patriarch declared days of fasting and prayer. Still, the churches overflowed with the dead. To the north, the plague advanced up the Danube and Rhine. German towns, bound tightly by trade guilds and merchant leagues, watched the approaching storm with dread. But cutting off commerce was unthinkable. The Hanseatic League's ports remained open. Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen all welcomed ships that brought plague into the heart of Central Europe. The Alps did not stop it. Caravans from infected Italian. Cities crossed mountain passes carrying textiles, wines, and hidden rats. In villages that had never seen the sea, people began to die. Remote monasteries, thought to be sanctuaries of isolation, became tombs. Entire monastic orders were extinguished in a matter of weeks. In England, it arrived not through one invasion, but many. Ships from Gascony, long entangled in Anglo-French trade, brought the plague to the southern coast. Weymouth was among the first towns to fall. From there, the disease spread to Bristol, then the second largest city in England, and from there to London. By summer 1348, England was in free fall. London's narrow lanes and crowded homes proved ideal breeding grounds. So too did its markets and churches. The plague spread from baker to buyer, from priest to penitent. And yet the city didn't close. The king's court remained in motion. Legal proceedings continued. So did commerce. Life didn't stop. It staggered on, dragging the disease with it. The English countryside was no safer. Manorial lords fled their estates. Fields went unharvested. Serfs wandered in search of food or shelter, often bringing plague to new hamlets. Pilgrims still walked between holy sites. Beggars still traveled from town to town. Every movement was a gamble. Every human connection a new opportunity for death to leap. Even the seas couldn't hold it back. The plague reached Norway via a ship bound for Bergen. The crew was dead before it docked. Fishermen who approached out of curiosity later infected their entire village. Iceland and Greenland would report outbreaks in the years that followed. No edge of Europe was untouched. Why was the plague so unstoppable? Because trade could not be halted. Commerce was Europe's nervous system, and its Achilles heel. A town that closed its gates could not survive long without food, salt, or fuel. A city that banned ships would find itself bankrupt. Leaders faced a cruel choice: death by disease or death by starvation and revolt. Some tried creative solutions. In the port of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, officials mandated that travelers wait in isolation outside the city for 30 days. Later, extended to 40. Thus, quarantine was born. Elsewhere, watchmen were placed at gates, bells were rung to signal outbreaks, and markets were moved to fields outside town walls. But these measures were piecemeal. The plague was always one step ahead. The disease itself was invisible. No one knew what to look for. Theories abounded: bad air, poisoned wells, foreign agents. Some towns posted guards at water sources. Others burned sweet herbs in the streets. None of it mattered. The rats moved unseen. The fleas moved faster. By the end of 1349, nearly every major trade route in Europe had been touched. From the Silk Road to the English Channel, from the Danube to the Baltic Sea, all bore the stain of plague. It traveled faster than letters, killed faster than swords. Empires built on movement were now choking on it. In the past, plague outbreaks had been localized, a town, a region. But this was different. The interconnectedness of 14th century Europe, once its greatest strength, had become its ruin. The web of trade did not break under plague. It carried it, and so death became a passenger. Not just in carts and ships, but in contracts, in rituals, in the very expectation that life should continue. Plague rode in the heart of commerce, and everywhere it went, the balance of the world shifted. Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, stood proud in the spring of 1348. Its streets overflowed with color: crimson silks from Venice, golden brocades from the east, and the glint of florins exchanged in the hands of bankers and craftsmen. It was a city of artists and ambition, of cathedrals rising toward heaven and merchants plotting fortune behind arched windows. And yet, for all its wealth, all its culture, Florence was utterly defenseless when the plague arrived. It came quietly as always. A merchant returned from Pisa. A servant boy collapsed in the square. A monk fell ill after giving confession to a traveler. Then the coughing began. Then the swellings. Then the death. At first, the city did not panic. Florence had seen illness before: fevers in the summer, infections in winter. But within days, physicians began to die. Within a week, entire households were struck down. The rich, watching from their balconies, sent servants to investigate. Many of those servants did not return. By the second week, the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore tolled so constantly that people stopped hearing them. The sound of mourning had become background noise. The government tried to respond. The Signoria, Florence's ruling council, declared emergency measures. But no law could restrain what they could not understand. The streets became battlegrounds, not of armies, but of silence, of suspicion, of burning incense and shuttered homes. Those who could afford to flee did so without hesitation. Wealthy families packed carts, loaded wagons with valuables, and retreated to countryside villas. They abandoned shops, workshops, even family tombs. Some took entire households with them: cooks, tailors, musicians, and tried to recreate courtly life in isolation. They thought distance would keep them safe. Sometimes it did. Other times, the plague followed them into marble halls and olive groves. Those who remained had no choice. The poor could not leave. They worked in bakeries, cleaned alleys, sold goods in open markets. And when sickness reached them, there was no villa to run to, no physician on call. When the fever struck, they burned rags and rosemary and hoped the gods, or the saints, might show mercy. Few did. As the weeks passed, Florence descended into something far worse than fear: lawlessness. Shops were looted. Empty homes were broken into, not for gold, but for food and wine. People wore masks soaked in vinegar, clutched charms against their chests, avoided eye contact. Others gave in to chaos. Debauchery flourished in the ruins of reason. Some turned taverns into places of revelry, believing that if death was inevitable, they would meet it drunk and dancing. Others barricaded themselves inside and starved in the name of purity. The church tried to remain a source of comfort. But even the clergy were overwhelmed. Monks buried monks. Nuns wept over empty pews. Holy water ran out. Priests began performing mass from behind curtains or refused to give last rites altogether. The Bishop of Florence held one final mass from the steps of the Duomo, his voice hoarse with grief, before disappearing from public view. He died days later. What terrified Florentines most was not just how quickly people died, but how they died. The sickness twisted the body. Buboes swelled to grotesque sizes. Blackened spots spread across skin. Victims bled from the nose, vomited blood, screamed for water. And then, stillness. No pattern made sense. Children died before parents. Strong men succumbed in hours. Prostitutes survived while nobles perished. It was chaos without design, and that made it unendurable. In the midst of this, Boccaccio, a young writer and observer, recorded what he saw. He wrote of people abandoning family, of mothers refusing to touch dying sons, of lovers who watched one another fade from across the room. He described Florence not as a city, but as a graveyard, pretending to function. In his Decameron, he told tales, fiction spun from horror, but rooted in the aching truth of a city that had lost itself. The death toll climbed beyond reckoning. Some chroniclers claimed 60% of the city perished. Others said it was closer to 75%. Entire streets became silent. No children laughed in the alleys, no musicians played in the piazzas. The fountains still ran, but no one came to drink. Florence, which once boasted the finest artisans in Europe, could no longer bury its own dead. Bodies were left in doorways, wrapped in linen or old curtains. Grave diggers refused to work. The city dug trenches outside its walls. Some were 20 feet deep, filled with lime, covered hastily, then reopened the next day to receive more. And then came the burning. With the cemeteries full and the dead rotting in homes, the city resorted to flame. Entire blocks were set alight. The poor, sick, and healthy alike were forcibly removed so their neighborhoods could be cleansed. Whole families vanished in smoke. It was not justice. It was fear with a torch. This was the great divide. The rich fled, the poor burned. Some tried to find meaning. Flagellant movements arrived in Florence. Men who marched through the streets, whipping themselves, chanting prayers, calling for repentance. They were alternately welcomed and feared. Some brought hope. Others brought the plague. Conspiracy took root. Whispers of poisoners, of Jews casting spells, of lepers spreading contagion in service of devils. Mobs formed. Riots erupted. Innocents were killed in the name of imagined enemies. The plague revealed not only the fragility of the human body, but of the human mind. By the end of summer, the disease began to slow, not because it had been defeated, but because there were fewer people left to infect. The fire had burned through all the wood. The rich began to return. Their villas had spared them the worst. They came back to empty homes, silent workshops, orphaned streets. Some sought to rebuild. Others quietly reclaimed property, hired new servants, resumed commerce. But the city they returned to was not the one they had left. Something fundamental had broken. Florence had not fallen, but it had been transformed. The survivors carried trauma, yes, but also questions. Why had the poor suffered most? Why had the church failed? Why had the laws meant to protect all people only shielded the wealthy? These questions would linger long after the plague withdrew. They would shape art, politics, and faith in ways that even the survivors could not foresee. In the rubble of death, Florence would one day bloom again into the heart of the Renaissance. But that would take time. For now, in 1348, it was just a city of ashes, echoing with the footsteps of ghosts and the whispers of those who lived not by virtue, but by chance. They became the most recognizable image of the plague. Towering, robed figures in black, their faces hidden behind white bird-like masks with long, curved beaks. They moved through cities like wraiths, gliding past corpses, waving sticks to measure distance. For centuries, they would haunt paintings and nightmares alike. But in truth, the plague doctor was not born of medicine. He was born of desperation. Before the 14th century, there was no formal medical response to pandemics. Physicians, if available at all, served the wealthy. For the poor, healing came from herbalists, midwives, monks, or through prayer. There were no hospitals as we know them, only rudimentary infirmaries attached to monasteries or guilds. When the Black Death arrived, it overwhelmed these systems in a matter of days. Doctors died alongside patients. Healers fled. Monks who tended the sick became the sick. Cities, staring down mortality on a scale they couldn't fathom, realized they needed a new kind of figure, one who wouldn't run. The plague doctor was not a man of learning, not at first. He was a function, a contract, a city's last resort. Municipal governments, from Florence to Avignon, from Hamburg to Dubrovnik, began hiring individuals to act as public health officers. Their job was simple: treat the sick, tally the dead, and do not leave the city under any circumstance. In return, they were paid well. Sometimes they were offered pensions or land. Sometimes they were coerced. The role attracted the brave, the foolish, and the desperate. Most plague doctors were not medical experts. Many had minimal training, but they were given authority. They could inspect homes, order quarantines, and record cause of death. In some cities, they also served as witnesses for wills or final confessions, notaries with a mask. The uniform came later. As the death toll rose, fear of contagion deepened. It was believed that foul air, miasma, carried disease. To combat this, doctors began wearing robes coated in wax or oil to repel corrupted vapors. Gloves, boots, and wide-brimmed hats were added. But it was the mask that truly defined them. The beak was not for show. It was a filter, or so they hoped. The long nose was stuffed with aromatic herbs, lavender, mint, cloves, camphor. Some included myrrh, rose petals, or even vinegar-soaked sponges. The idea was to purify the air before it reached the lungs. The round glass eye holes protected against bad air entering through the eyes, or so they believed. The mask created distance, psychological as well as physical. The doctor became something other than human, a creature apart, immune, untouched by death. For some patients, it was a symbol of hope. For others, it was the last face they saw. They carried wooden canes, not as walking sticks, but as tools of separation. With them, they lifted blankets, examined wounds, prodded bodies. The cane was both pointer and barrier. The doctor did not touch. He observed, recorded, moved on. Not all plague doctors were created equal. Some were earnest, attempting cures, staying with the sick, risking their lives. Others were opportunists. Reports survive of doctors extorting the desperate, forging death records, or abandoning their posts. In some towns, plague doctors were hunted when the disease subsided, blamed for the very deaths they were meant to record. Their treatments were primitive. Bloodletting was common, slicing open a vein to release supposed bad humors. Leeches were applied. Boils were lanced. Poultices of onions, butter, and garlic were smeared over sores. Patients were made to inhale smoke, drink crushed emeralds, or wear talismans. Nothing worked. But still they tried. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI hired plague doctors to tend the city's exploding death toll. The corpses were so many that mass graves were dug by the hundreds. The doctors, faceless and silent, moved among the pits, counting, naming, measuring. Their records, crude as they were, now serve as some of the only data we have about the pandemic's scale. In Paris, they walked through the left bank, scribbling in journals as carriages of bodies passed by. In Venice, they prowled the canals by boat, calling to the sick from behind veils. In London, they entered homes alone, chalking symbols on doors, estimating time of death from the smell. They were feared as much as they were needed. Some cities immortalized them in art. Woodcuts and manuscripts began depicting the beaked figure as a harbinger, part doctor, part death. Satirical poems mocked their failures. Nursery rhymes whispered their names. But even in mockery, they became myth. They were not immortal. Many died. Despite their robes and masks, they fell like everyone else. Few plague doctors served more than one city. Fewer still lived long enough to retire. Their role was temporary, a grim utility born of necessity. And when the plague passed, they were dismissed, forgotten, or buried with the patients they could not save. But their image endured. Centuries later, the beaked mask would return in paintings, in theater, in carnival. In Venice, the Medico della Peste became a costume, a reminder of death turned spectacle. In modern times, the mask would find new life in books, games, and nightmares, a symbol not just of plague, but of how humanity faces the unknown, with masks, myths, and ritual. Yet beneath the myth was something more human. The plague doctor was not a villain. He was not a hero. He was simply someone who stayed when others ran. Someone who walked into the house where no one else dared enter. Someone who recorded, who watched, who bore witness. In a world unraveling, that act alone was a kind of courage. The plague doctor did not stop the Black Death, but he gave it shape. And in doing so, he helped the world begin to understand that disease was not fate. It was something that could be seen, named, and one day perhaps defeated. It began with silence. Then came the bells. In city after city, as the Black Death spread like smoke through a dry forest, the bells became the rhythm of life, or more precisely, the rhythm of death. Every morning, every hour, every time, soul departed, they told. What once rang to mark weddings and baptisms now marked a different ceremony, one without hymns, without hope, without end. But soon even the bells grew tired. The bell ringers fell ill. The churches overflowed. The dead came faster than the chimes could keep pace. In the early days, the dead were buried with ceremony. Coffins were built. Priests were summoned. Families gathered, trembling behind veils and scarves soaked in wine and herbs. They whispered prayers. They clutched rosaries. They wept. Then the deaths multiplied. Soon the carpenters were dead. The priests were dead. The families were dead. The gravediggers could no longer keep up. Pits were dug in the outskirts of town. Great yawning holes carved into earth not yet frozen by winter. At first, they tried to keep order. A layer of bodies, then a layer of dirt. a line of lime, then more bodies. But within weeks, the rhythm collapsed. Bodies were dumped in by the cartload, piled atop one another like kindling. There was no space for names, no time for rites. In Florence, mass graves stretched for miles. In London, plague pits were dug in Moorfields and Aldgate, some so deep that those digging them perished before they could climb out. In Paris, the Holy Innocent Cemetery filled so quickly that bodies were stacked 6 layers deep. One chronicler from Siena wrote, "No bells rang, no tears were shed. Nobody could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without ceremony. The people adapted. They had no choice. At first, they resisted. A father would drag his child's body to the church door and pound until someone answered. A widow would wait outside the cathedral, clutching a corpse, begging for a final blessing. But the clergy were overwhelmed and afraid. Many sealed the doors. Others hung cloth over their mouths, waving holy water from a distance. Then came the carts. In the worst-hit cities, death became a scheduled service. Wooden carts would rattle through narrow streets, their wheels caked in mud and blood, their drivers masked or drunken or both. They rang small bells or called out in gravelly voices, "Bring out your dead." People emerged from doorways with wrapped bundles, sometimes bodies, sometimes the dying. There was no place left to store the dead. In homes, corpses were shoved under tables, beneath beds, into corners. Some were stacked by the front door, offerings for the next passing cart. In the countryside, fields once used for wheat and grapes became cemeteries without markers. Smell was everywhere. The scent of rot, of lime, of burned incense, of fear. Candles could not cover it. Perfumes only added to the sickening mix. Cities smelled like open wounds. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI consecrated the entire Rhone River so that bodies thrown into it would receive a holy burial. It was a desperate solution, but desperation defined this time. The records are inconsistent. They always are in times of chaos. Some cities claimed half their population died. Others said 2/3. In truth, many stopped counting. What was the point? The dead were no longer individuals. They were part of the landscape. Children played near the plague pits, too young to understand. Dogs sniffed around edges, drawn by instinct. Some bodies rose again in swollen gases, split open by heat and time. Others were consumed by fire when towns tried, too late, to stop the disease by burning the dead. And yet, amid all this, life continued. Somehow, people still baked bread, still sold meat, still haggled over cloth. There were still weddings, hurried and joyless. There were births, even as mothers coughed blood in childbed. There were thieves who robbed the dead. There were artists who sketched them. In cities like Lübeck and Krakow, attempts were made to document the numbers. Scrolls filled with names, ledgers inked with columns. But over time, the records ended mid-line, as if the scribe had simply stopped breathing. The church tried to preserve dignity, even in despair. Some bishops demanded that the dead be buried facing east, toward Jerusalem. Others ordered crosses placed atop mass graves, but most efforts fell apart as clergy themselves collapsed. Faith, once the backbone of Europe, strained under the weight of unanswered prayers. People turned to other explanations. Some believed the plague pits were cursed, that burying the dead in such numbers offended God, that their spirits would rise, that they already had. Stories spread of strange lights over burial fields, of sounds in the night, of children who wandered, too close and never returned. It didn't matter whether the stories were true. They were necessary. Myths are the scaffolding we build over horror, and still the graves widened. In some towns, when pits overflowed, people threw the dead into wells. In others, bodies were hidden in walls, A few families, too afraid to face the outside, buried loved ones beneath their own floors. Years later, these skeletons would be uncovered, curled in corners, dressed in their final moments. The death became routine. It was not shocking anymore. It was not mourned. It simply was. Parents stopped naming their newborns. Why bother? Neighbors stopped asking who had died. Everyone had. The bells no longer tolled. The silence had returned. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the plague receded. In some cities, it simply vanished, like a storm moving on. In others, it slowed to a trickle. People emerged, blinking, from shuttered homes. They looked around, at a world both familiar and foreign. Empty houses, overgrown streets, shuttered churches, graves without markers. The survivors did not cheer. There was no parade, no sense of victory, just numbness. But from the earth, something had shifted. In the soil of those mass graves, in the silence that followed the bells, Europe had begun to change. It would not be obvious at first, but in time, the way people thought about life and death would never be the same. Long before the microscope, before laboratories and vaccines, before the idea of bacteria or airborne pathogens, humanity still sought answers. When the Black Death swept through Europe, killing without pause or mercy, it left behind more than just bodies. It left behind a need to understand. And in that void of knowledge, people turned to what they knew best: the heavens, the church, and each other. In the earliest days of the plague, the most common explanation was also the most ancient. Divine punishment. For many, the plague was God's fury made manifest. A scouring of the earth, a second flood, this time of blood and breath. Priests thundered from pulpits that the sins of mankind had grown too numerous. That greed, lust, and pride had poisoned the soul of Christendom. The plague, they claimed, was the reckoning foretold. Cities organized processions of repentance. Barefoot pilgrims marched through cobbled streets, chanting prayers and striking their own backs with leather whips. These were the flagellants, men and women who believed that only through pain could the anger of God be soothed. Their numbers swelled with every funeral bell. Clad in white, with red crosses on their chests, they traveled from town to town, drawing crowds. At first, they were welcomed. Later, feared. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI was besieged not only by plague, but by pleas for answers. He declared days of fasting and prayer. He issued indulgences for the dead. He consecrated rivers, fields, even the air itself. And yet the bodies kept coming. Even the Pope's personal physicians fell, one after another. Holy men died beside heretics. The plague made no distinction. So the questions deepened. Some turned to astrology. Scholars at the University of Paris, the most esteemed minds of their time, concluded in 1348 that the plague had been caused by a rare triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius on March 20th, 1345. This planetary alignment, they claimed, had corrupted the air, heating and drying it in such a way that disease was inevitable. The report was copied, translated, and spread across Europe. It gave comfort, not because it could cure, but because it offered structure. Others pointed downward, to the earth itself. They blamed swamps, decaying matter, foul smells. The theory of miasma, poisonous air, took root. People believed the plague moved, with the wind clinging to bad odors, slipping through shutters and under doors. In response, cities ordered bonfires lit in the streets. Herbs were burned, incense swung from windows. People carried pomanders, small containers of flowers and spices, and held them to their faces whenever they passed a corpse. In Florence, citizens burned barrels of juniper and rosemary. In Paris, priests waved thuribles of frankincense. long alleyways thick with stench. In Venice, chimneys smoked day and night, filling the air with soot in a desperate attempt to purify the skies. Still, the plague did not stop. With no single explanation satisfying the fear, other suspicions took hold. Conspiracies bloomed in the dark. Whispers that someone, somewhere, must have caused this. That no punishment arrived without an executioner. Jews, already marginalized across much of Europe, became convenient scapegoats. Accusations spread that they had poisoned wells, that they had summoned demons, that they had plotted revenge. These, rumors baseless and cruel, ignited massacres. In Strasbourg, Basel, Mainz, and dozens of other towns, Jewish communities were destroyed. Entire families were burned alive, synagogues razed. Those who converted to Christianity were sometimes spared, often still killed. It was genocide under the mask of plague, and it was not only Jews. Lepers were accused, foreigners, vagabonds, anyone strange, anyone other. In the absence of reason, the mob chose its own logic. Meanwhile, the medical community fractured. University doctors wrote long treatises on balancing the humors. They advised bloodletting to release the excess bile that caused fever. They prescribed purging, vomiting, enemas, diets of cold foods in summer, warm broths in winter. Few patients survived. Some advised more creative methods. One physician in Venice recommended burying a toad beside the afflicted. Another in England promoted rubbing crushed emeralds into the skin. In Avignon, a noted healer swore by bathing, urine warmed by sunlight. But the plague didn't care for theory. It moved with bodies, with rats, with breath. And still, people searched for meaning. Monasteries debated whether the plague was the end of days. Some abbots proclaimed the return of the Antichrist. Others interpreted the disease as a test, not of faith, but of obedience, a call to purge society of its corruptions, to cleanse the soul and the street. In some towns, this led to self-imposed purges. Brothels were closed, taverns burned, gambling outlawed. In others, it led to grotesque rituals. In one French village, locals paraded through the streets in silence, their mouths sewn shut with thread in hopes of showing humility. But not all explanations were rooted in fear. A few thinkers began to suspect something else, that the disease was not punishment, not poison, but a contagion, that it moved from person to person, house to house. A Florentine doctor named Gentile da Foligno observed that servants of the sick often died soon after their masters. That proximity, not sin, was the pattern. He was among the first to recommend isolation, true separation of the ill from the healthy. He died weeks later, and yet the seeds had been planted. In Milan, a more pragmatic approach emerged. When a case of plague was discovered, the entire household was sealed inside. Food was delivered. No one was allowed out. It was cruel, but effective. Milan suffered far fewer deaths than other major cities. In Venice, port officials began holding ships offshore. They waited 30 days, then 40. 40 giorni, quarantine. It was an idea born not of divine terror, but of observation. Still, these measures were rare. Most people remained trapped between superstition and ritual, between prayers and punishments, between scapegoats and the stars. They asked why the wicked died alongside the pious, why children were taken while murderers survived, why the innocent suffered while the powerful returned to their villas untouched. And when no answer came, they stopped asking. Silence became the explanation, a silence filled with the creak of cartwheels, the drone of funeral bells, the hush of empty chapels. And in that silence, the foundations of Europe trembled. The plague would not be the last. Others would come. But in this first great wave, the world learned that it did not know itself as well as it thought, that neither scripture nor science, fear nor fire could hold back death once it had chosen its path. But from that uncertainty, a new curiosity began to stir. Not yet revolution, not yet reason, but a question. What if there was another way? When the bells rang too often, when the priests fell silent, and when the explanations ran dry, fear became the last authority. And fear, when left untethered, births extremes. By the late summer of 1348, as the Black Death ravaged cities from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, it became clear that no prayer, no relic, no holy water had stopped the tide. For the faithful, this posed a spiritual crisis. If the church could not protect them, who could? If priests were dying faster than sinners, what hope was there for redemption? Into that spiritual vacuum stepped the flagellants. They did not come quietly. They marched in rows, barefoot, robed in white linen or coarse wool, red crosses stitched into their chests. In one hand, they carried banners of the crucified Christ. In the other, whips with metal tips. And with these, they struck their backs in unison, again and again, as they chanted hymns and psalms through bloodied mouths. They came in groups of 50, 100, sometimes more. From Germany to the Netherlands, from Switzerland to France, their processions swept through towns like a second wave, not of death but of spectacle. Where plague carts had emptied the streets, the flagellants filled them with ritual. They performed 33-day pilgrimages, one day for every year of Christ's life, pausing in each town to perform their rites. Their message was clear. The Black Death was punishment for humanity's sins, and if the church would not cleanse it, they would, with their own blood. At first, they were welcome. In cities where priests had died or fled, the flagellants offered a kind of grim reassurance. People wept as they watched them march. Some believed their suffering could redeem entire communities. Food and lodging were offered. Children were blessed. Streets were cleared. But over time, awe gave way to alarm. The flagellants brought more than penance. They brought doctrine. Their own. Many rejected the authority of the Pope, accusing the Church of corruption and cowardice. They preached that salvation came not through sacraments, but through suffering. That whips replaced confessionals. That the soul could only be purified by visible pain. They banned clergy from joining their ranks. They named cities as Babylon. Some called for the destruction of churches. Others declared that the end times had begun and only the flagellants would be spared. And wherever they went, violence followed. Jews, already blamed in many cities for poisoning wells or bringing the plague, now became targets for flagellant wrath. In Mainz, Erfurt, Strasbourg, and dozens of towns across the Holy Roman Empire, flagellants stirred the mob. Entire Jewish quarters were burned, men, women, and children slaughtered in the streets, synagogues torn down, scrolls of Torah set aflame. The authorities, watching this spiritual wildfire, were divided. Some tried to co-opt the movement, allowing it in small, regulated forms. Others turned a blind eye. But the church in Avignon, under Pope Clement VI, saw the danger clearly. These were not pilgrims. They were fanatics. Heresy cloaked in blood. In 1349, the Pope issued a bull condemning the flagellant processions. He forbade clergy from supporting them. Local bishops were ordered to suppress them. In some cities, flagellants were arrested, even executed. But by then, the movement had splintered, and many groups had gone underground, hiding their rituals in barns, forests, or abandoned chapels. Not all flagellants were violent. Some truly believed their pain could save lives. Others simply followed the rhythm of the whip, lost in the pageantry of collective penance. But in the haze of disease and death, distinctions blurred, extremes merged, and the flagellants were not alone. Other cults emerged. In southern France, apocalyptic prophets declared that the Pope had been replaced by the devil. In Bohemia, splinter sects predicted the second coming of Christ, not as a prince of peace, but as a destroyer of the corrupt. In Italy, bands of self-declared saints wandered the countryside, dressed in rags, preaching fire and vengeance. These were not organized rebellions. They were spasms of belief, erupting wherever institutions collapsed. In towns where law had failed and the church lay empty, people clung to anything that felt like purpose. And then there were the silent ones, the anchorites, the hermits, men and women who retreated into isolation, believing that only solitude could shield them from plague and sin alike. Some walled themselves inside church alcoves, others built huts in forests. A few buried themselves alive, speaking to passers-by through tiny holes in the ground. They fasted, prayed, and waited for God to notice. Each extreme reflected a truth. The plague was not only a medical crisis, it was a spiritual one. It tore the fabric of the world and exposed the threads. Faith, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. And on that battlefield, people chose sides: the whip, the torch, the silence. The church, for its part, struggled to recover authority. In cities like Cologne and Vienna, bishops tried to reassert doctrine, but the damage had been done. The people had seen that priests could die like anyone else, that relics could rot, that incense could not drown the smell of death. A seed had been planted. Not of disbelief, but of doubt. And in that doubt, the foundation of medieval Christendom began to shift, not overnight, not by rebellion, but by erosion. Some would return to the church, chastened and humbled. Others would never trust it again. And still others would remember the flagellants not as saviors, but as shadows, marching through the streets, bleeding for a world that no longer made sense. When the plague receded, so too did the extremes. The processions ended. The whips were stored. The fanatics faded into memory, but their legacy lingered in stories, in paintings, in whispered warnings passed to children, that when fear becomes greater than faith, even piety can turn dangerous. When answers are few and fear is many, the mind looks for blame, and during the Black Death, blame became a weapon. By 1348, as the plague carved its way across Europe, leaving cities hollowed and nations paralyzed, people no longer searched for causes in the stars or scriptures alone. They looked to their neighbors, the ones who looked different, spoke different, prayed different. They looked to the Jews. Jewish communities had lived across Europe for centuries, in ghettos, in walled quarters, sometimes tolerated, sometimes taxed, sometimes attacked. They were moneylenders when Christian law forbade usury. They were physicians, scribes, merchants. They lived under Christian rule, but outside its full protection. And now, in the haze of death and desperation, they became the scapegoats. Rumors began in Switzerland that the Jews had poisoned the wells, that they had imported plague-tainted powder from the East, that they had conspired to destroy Christendom in revenge for centuries of exile. These whispers became words. The words became accusations, and the accusations became fire. In the town of Chillon, on the shore of Lake Geneva, a man was tortured until he confessed. He named accomplices. Names begot more names. Soon, hundreds. Jews were arrested. Some were executed, others burned. The pattern repeated in Zurich, in Freiburg, in Bern. The plague did not distinguish between faiths. It killed Jew and Christian alike, but the mob did. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, the bishop left the city. Whether in protest or in fear, still debated. Days later, the city council ordered a purge. Nearly 2,000 Jews were herded into a wooden platform built over the town's burial pits. The structure was set alight. Those who did not burn were murdered, children included. Survivors were expelled. Their property was seized. their names erased from the city rolls, and Strasbourg was not the worst. In Mainz, the largest Jewish community, in Germany, word spread that wells had been poisoned. The local archbishop initially tried to protect the Jews, even offered sanctuary in his palace, but under pressure from townspeople and guilds, he relented. A mob stormed the Jewish quarter. Houses were burned, entire families slaughtered, the bishop's palace was breached. Even those under his protection were dragged out and killed. It is said that in some towns, Jewish residents, hearing what had happened in nearby cities, chose to end their own lives, together with prayer, rather than face the fires of the mob. Not every city joined the frenzy. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull condemning the violence. He declared that Jews were dying of the plague just as Christians were, that no evidence of poisoning had been found, that anyone attacking Jews would face excommunication. But the bull came too late, or fell on ears too deafened by terror. In many towns, local lords ignored the decree. In others, they used the chaos to cancel debts owed to Jewish lenders. Pogroms became financially convenient. The mechanics of persecution became organized. In some regions, the crown or nobility offered protection for a fee. Jews could remain if they paid special taxes, if they agreed to wear badges, if they surrendered their arms, if they lived in designated quarters. These privileges could be revoked at any time. Even in cities where Jews were spared, they were marked. Forbidden from owning land, barred from trade, used as scapegoats for economic collapse. And the plague, indifferent to guilt, continued to spread. What made this wave of violence so horrifying was its scale and its permanence. Unlike past attacks which flared and faded, the pogroms of the Black Death emptied entire regions. In Germany, hundreds of Jewish communities vanished. In Spain, some converted under duress, others fled. In France, where Jews had already faced cycles of expulsion, many now disappeared without record. The survivors scattered eastward, into Poland, Lithuania, the Ottoman Empire, places that, for a time, offered relative safety. But they carried with them the memory of flames, of betrayed neighbors, of prayers recited beneath locked doors while screams echoed from the streets outside. And the trauma lived on. Jewish texts from the era reflect a theology reshaped by terror. Some saw the plague as a test of faith, others as a punishment for assimilation. Still others simply recorded the names of the dead and the names of those who had once shared bread, and then lit the torches. Christian chroniclers, too, eventually looked back with discomfort. A few condemned the killings. Others justified them. Some simply omitted them. History, after all, is often written to soothe the victors. But in the ruins of those communities, in the ashes of burned synagogues and the silence of abandoned quarters, a truth lingers. That in moments of fear, even the bonds of neighbor and friend can be severed. That reason can be drowned by rumor. That suffering, instead of uniting, can divide. The plague killed millions, but the pogroms revealed something deeper, that beneath the surface of society, a second disease had always waited. One made not of blood or breath, but of hate. And in 1348, that disease found its moment. England heard the plague before it saw it. It came first in letters, grim dispatches from France, from Genoa, from the papal court in Avignon. Whispers of sickness, ships arriving with silent decks, cities emptied. Then came the refugees, sailors, merchants, monks. The sick among them tried to hide their coughs. The healthy moved with urgency. And behind them, like a shadow gaining speed, came the Black Death. The first confirmed case arrived in the summer of 1348 in the port town of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. A trading vessel, likely from Gascony, docked with a crew already infected. Within days, the sickness spread across the town. Within weeks, it moved west to Bristol and inland to Winchester. London was only a matter of time. England's government was not prepared. Parliament, already a delicate balancing act between monarch and barons, froze. Laws could not stop the plague. Edicts were ignored. The courts ceased functioning. Trials were abandoned. Records went unkept. When royal messengers arrived to summon representatives to Westminster, many refused. Others were dead. King Edward III remained in London for a time, issuing orders, attempting to maintain control. But even he could not resist the fear that gripped the court. He fled to Windsor Castle, locking himself away with his household, isolating his family, including his young daughter, Joan. She would later be sent to Bordeaux to marry a Castilian prince, and would die of the plague before ever reaching the altar. The church tried to hold its ground. Bishops called for days of prayer. Cathedrals held masses. But priests died in such numbers that, in some towns, anyone who could mutter the Lord's Prayer was pressed into service to bury the dead. Pope Clement VI issued blanket indulgences for those who died of plague. In England, this became a silent comfort for many, a last assurance of salvation, even if no priest was present. The burial crisis struck hardest in London. The capital was a labyrinth of alleys, merchant stalls, tenements. When the plague arrived in autumn 1348, it moved rapidly. By November, mass graves were being dug at Smithfield and outside the walls of Clerkenwell. Entire parishes ceased to function. John of Reading, a monk at Westminster Abbey, wrote in his chronicle, "Death came among us with such cruelty that none were safe and none were spared. So many clergy died that the Archbishop of Canterbury appealed to the Pope for permission to ordain men faster and at younger ages, just to keep the church staffed. A generation of spiritual leadership was wiped away in months. Outside the city, the countryside fared no better. Villages disappeared, not figuratively, but literally. Entire hamlets emptied. Fields went untilled. Sheep wandered without shepherds. Cattle starved in pens. In Cambridgeshire, chroniclers noted the silence of the harvest season. No songs in the fields, no carts rumbling down the lanes. In Kent, a village called Dode was so thoroughly emptied that only the church remained. Legend said the final survivors locked themselves inside, hoping to pray their way to safety. None emerged. The economic shock was immediate. Laborers died in staggering numbers, leaving crops unharvested, mills unmanned, and trade routes untraveled. Landowners, unable to gather their produce or maintain estates, faced ruin. Towns began offering higher wages to lure surviving workers. This, in turn, enraged the nobility. In 1349, King Edward issued the Ordinance of Laborers, a decree freezing wages at pre-plague levels and demanding that able-bodied men and women work at the same rate as before. It was an attempt to restore the old order. It failed. Too many were dead, and the survivors knew their worth. Social tension simmered. While the upper classes sought to reimpose control, the lower classes saw opportunity. For the first time in memory, laborers could choose where to work, and at what price. Former serfs walked away from manors. Apprentices took over abandoned shops. Women, widowed or orphaned, entered trades previously closed to them. This was not revolution, not yet, but it was change. The nobility, meanwhile, watched their world shrink. Inheritance laws collapsed under the weight of too many deaths. Titles passed rapidly. Some estates fractured. Others fell into royal hands. A new class of landowners began to emerge. Men who had been minor gentry or even merchants now elevated. By survival and opportunity, even the universities suffered. At Oxford and Cambridge, entire faculties perished. Classes ceased. Knowledge was lost. Manuscripts went unpreserved. But in the ruins, new thinking began. A generation raised amid death began to ask new questions about medicine, about faith, about the structure of power itself. In Parliament, when it finally reconvened, the tone had shifted. Survivors spoke not only of taxes and war, but of reform. Local councils began to take on more responsibility. The old, centralized control of the crown had faltered during the plague. In its absence, a new civic identity had begun to form, based on community resilience rather than royal decree. But England was not healed. In 1350, the plague receded, not vanished, simply slowed. But its ghost remained in every empty village, every overgrown field, every hollow-eyed survivor. Families were broken, parishes abandoned, the church weakened, Parliament humbled. The years that followed were uneasy. Beneath the surface of recovery there was anger, questions of fairness, of fate, of how those who lived should live now. The world had not ended, but it had changed, and England, no longer a land of certainty and order, had begun to sense the cracks beneath its ancient foundations. The seeds of unrest were sown in the graves of the plague, and it would not be long before they sprouted. The Black Death did not end with death. It left survivors, and those survivors, ragged, grieving, and angry, were not the same people they had been before the plague arrived. In England, by the time the pestilence loosened its grip in 1350, the old world was cracked. A third, perhaps half the population was gone. Entire villages lay abandoned. The churches echoed hollow. The land remained, but the hands that once tilled it were buried. For centuries, the kingdom had run on hierarchy. Lords ruled, clergy guided, peasants served. Everyone knew their place. But after the plague, those places were empty. Fields were unharvested, roads untraveled. Nobles pleaded for workers to return, but the peasants, for the first time, had choices. Wages rose, not by law, but by scarcity. Laborers moved where the coin was better. Boundaries meant little when survival demanded mobility. This frightened the ruling class. They saw order slipping away, so they acted, not with understanding, but with force. In 1351, King Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers. It forbade wages from rising above pre-plague levels. It criminalized workers who left their lords without permission. It was a law meant to freeze time, to bring back a world that no longer existed. But time does not move backward. The law was resisted, evaded, yet the pressure did not stop. New taxes were levied to fund the crown's war in France. In 1377, 1379, and again in 1381, a poll tax was imposed, not based on wealth or land, but simply for being alive. Every man, woman, and adolescent owed the crown, rich or poor, noble, or beggar. For the survivors of the plague, many of whom had lost families and livelihoods, the tax was not just a burden, it was an insult. And then, in the summer of 1381, it broke. It began in Essex and Kent, where tax collectors arrived with soldiers to enforce the third poll tax. The people refused. There were scuffles, then arrests, then a constable was killed. The spark caught dry kindling. Villages rose, men gathered. Word spread. Within days, thousands of peasants marched toward London, not as a disorganized mob, but with purpose. They were led not by knights or priests, but by men of the soil. Most notably, Wat Tyler, a former soldier and tiler by trade. Charismatic, bold, and unrelenting. With him marched John Ball, a radical preacher who had long questioned the justice of hierarchy. He had once been imprisoned for his sermons. Now he was the revolt's voice. "What right," Ball asked, "has one man to rule another when we are all born of Adam and Eve?" The question echoed through the English countryside. The rebels reached London in June. The gates opened, not by force, but by sympathy. London's poor saw themselves in the marchers. The city welcomed them. For a moment, revolution seemed possible. The rebels sought justice, not anarchy. They petitioned the young King Richard II, only 14 at the time, to end serfdom, to lower taxes, to punish corrupt officials. The king at first agreed. He met them at Mile End, promised reforms, promised pardon. But while promises were made, the Tower of London was stormed. The king's ministers were seized. Archbishop Simon Sudbury, hated for enforcing the poll tax, was dragged to Tower Hill and beheaded. His severed head was placed on a spike. The crowd cheered. Wat Tyler met the king again at Smithfield. He repeated the demands. The king's entourage, fearful and armed, bristled, tensions flared. Words were exchanged. Tyler, it is said, made a threatening motion. He was struck down by the Lord Mayor of London. The king, remarkably calm for his age, rode forward alone and called out to the stunned crowd, "I am your captain now. Follow me." The moment held. The rebels dispersed. And with that, the Yaini revolt ended, but the repression began. The king's promises were revoked. Pardons were torn up. Leaders were hunted. Hundreds were executed, some in public squares, others without trial. John Ball was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His body sent to four corners of the realm. Wat Tyler's head was mounted, beside the archbishop's, a grim display of royal retribution. And yet something had shifted. Though the revolt failed in the moment, it succeeded in time. The crown never again imposed a poll tax. The fear in the nobility was real, and it shaped policy for generations. Serfdom, though not abolished immediately, began to erode. By the early 15th century, it had largely vanished from England. The voice of the peasant had been heard, not just as a murmur, but as a roar. In the years that followed, a quiet revolution took root. Wages continued to rise. Laborers gained bargaining power. Markets expanded. A new middle class began to emerge. Merchants, skilled workers, free tenants. They built houses of stone. They read. They saved. They questioned. The world had changed. The Black Death had shattered the old order. The peasants' revolt cracked its foundations. And though the castle still stood, its walls were not as tall as before. History remembers kings and battles, cathedrals and crowns. But in 1381, for a brief, brilliant moment, it was the poor who took center stage, who stood before the throne not as servants, but as equals, who demanded to be seen and could not be unseen. When the Black Death receded, it did not do so with ceremony. There was no moment of triumph, no clear declaration of survival. It left quietly, as if ashamed of what it had done, and in its wake, it left emptiness. Europe was littered with the dead, and with places the living no longer returned to. Entire villages stood silent, roofs caved in, doors hung open, fields turned to weed-choked meadows, churches collapsed inward, their bells cracked, their pews covered in dust and bird. Droppings. There were no sounds, no footsteps, no candles, just silence and wind. Some of these settlements vanished from maps altogether. In England, they would come to be known as the Lost Villages. Over 2,500 recorded settlements were deserted. Not because of war, not because of famine, but because no one remained to carry on the name. Some were reclaimed by forest, others by time, and a few simply by forgetting. In France, once proud towns in Provence and Burgundy dwindled to hamlets. Trading posts along the Rhône fell into ruin. The roads to them crumbled. Travelers no longer passed by. Markets once filled with color and voice now echoed only in the memories of those who fled. In Germany, certain towns were so thoroughly emptied that the surviving authorities simply relocated. A new village would be built beside the old, newer walls, a new well, and the abandoned shell left to rot like a snake's shed skin. No one dared repopulate what had become a grave. The plague had reshaped the very geography of civilization, and yet the land remembered. Centuries later, when farmers plowed fields, they uncovered rows of stones. The foundations of homes long vanished. Shepherds stumbled upon sunken cemeteries. Children playing in meadows found bits of pottery, broken iron tools, half-buried thresholds. Archaeologists today still find entire communities beneath layers of soil, untouched since the 14th century. But in 1350, the question was not archaeology. It was survival. Cities, too, bore scars. London survived, but it limped. Parts of the city were abandoned for years. Graveyards overflowed. Entire parishes vanished. The city's population would not recover to pre-plague levels for nearly 200 years. Bruges, once the vibrant heart of Flemish commerce, entered a long decline. Florence, reeling from a population collapse, saw its political factions devour one another in the decades that followed. In Italy, the port of Pisa lost not only people, but power. Once a rival to Genoa and Venice, it found itself weakened, outpaced, diminished. The city stood, but the spark that had once defined it dimmed. Even Constantinople, ancient and mighty, was not immune. The plague drained it of strength. Though the walls remained, the soul flickered. A century later, it would fall to the Ottomans, not only because of cannons and tactics, but because of exhaustion. And then there were the graves, so many graves, some marked, most not. In the frenzy of plague, bodies were buried wherever there was space, orchards, pastures, courtyards, priests, too few in number, blessed pits from afar. Many corpses were not even named, just numbers, just cloth bundles lowered into lime-covered earth. After the plague, there was no mass reburial, no centralized effort to honor the forgotten. Life was too fragile, too urgent to look back. The survivors moved forward, not from disrespect, but from necessity. The past, too full of death, had to be left behind, but memory has its own gravity. Some returned to the plague pits to build chapels. Tiny shrines marked with worn crosses, their stone walls carved with prayers for the nameless. Others planted flowers or erected small markers. Pray for those lost here, 1348. Over time, those markers crumbled. The names were lost. The flowers did not return, and yet the ground held the truth. In England, beneath the modern streets of East Smithfield, thousands of plague victims lie in ordered rows, unearthed centuries later during excavations. In Toulouse, in Lubeck, in Venice, mass graves remain beneath supermarkets, highways, apartment blocks. Most who walk above them never know. But the dead are there, waiting, not for resurrection, but for remembrance. The abandonment was not only physical, it was psychological. The trauma of the plague ran deep. In many regions, people simply stopped talking about it. It became taboo, a wound best left untouched. Chroniclers wrote of kings, wars, saints, but skipped over the years of rot. Families omitted the names of those who died too quickly to mourn. Art turned away from realism, embracing symbolism and allegory instead. It was easier to paint angels than to recall neighbors gasping for air in darkened homes. Even religion shifted. The church, humiliated by its helplessness, doubled down on ritual. Flagellants were banned. Heretics burned. Indulgences sold in growing numbers. But faith had been wounded. A seed of doubt had been planted. It would take 2 centuries and a monk named Martin Luther for that seed to bloom. In the meantime, the world rebuilt, but not evenly. Some cities thrived on the emptying of others. Some landlords grew rich from abandoned plots, but many simply disappeared. Houses left to collapse under the rain, roads swallowed by moss, cemeteries turned to pasture. And so the land became a palimpsest, a layered memory of what was. Walk through certain woods in England, and you might find a line of stones beneath your feet. the remains of a wall once warmed by a hearth. Walk the vineyards of Burgundy, and you may drink wine whose roots grow in soil once soaked with lime and grief. The plague passed, but it did not leave. It remained. In the stories unspoken, in the ground unmarked, in the cities unlived, and in the quiet, where once bells rang and laughter echoed, only the wind remembers the names. In the year 1348, France was already bleeding. The 100 Years' War had begun a decade earlier. Its fields were trampled, its coffers strained, and its people weary. King Philip VI, first of the Valois line, ruled from Paris, a monarch born into turbulence. But even he could not foresee the invisible siege that approached, not with banners and trumpets, but with silence and rats. When the plague arrived, France was not united. It was a patchwork of provinces, Burgundy, Brittany, Normandy, Languedoc, each with its own customs, loyalties, and fractures. The war with England had exposed the brittleness of this patchwork. The Black Death would tear it further apart. The first deaths came from the south, Marseille, Avignon, Toulouse, ports that traded with Italy, with Spain, with the wider world. From there, it surged northward, Narbonne, Lyon, Orléans, and finally, Paris. The capital reeled. Its narrow streets, its overcrowded quarters, its open sewers, all perfect conduits. By the time the king's physicians understood the scale, it was already too late. Churches overflowed. Cemeteries burst. The Sorbonne halted its lectures. The Parlement stopped hearing cases. Paris fell quiet. Philip fled. The royal court relocated to safer ground, a countryside chateau distant from the dying. Royal proclamations continued, but they rang hollow in cities where even the town criers had succumbed. The king tried to act. He called for processions, ordered fasts, paid for masses across the realm. He consulted astrologers. He demanded quarantines, but his reach was limited. France was too vast, too fractured, and the plague too fast. Meanwhile, royal finances collapsed. The war with England had drained the treasury. Now, with trade halted and tax collectors dying, coin ceased to flow. Debts mounted. The crown began. Selling privileges, tax exemptions, legal rights, even access to the king himself. Nobles grumbled. Merchants whispered. The idea of a strong, sacred monarchy began to decay, not with rebellion, but with rot. And then, in 1350, Philip VI died. Not of plague, at least not officially. He died of what the records call a long illness, but in a kingdom where death was everywhere and diagnosis vague, the truth remains uncertain. His son, John II, inherited the throne, and with it, a kingdom in crisis. Known to history as John the Good, he was earnest, chivalric, and utterly unprepared. The plague had not finished with France, nor had the English. In 1356, John was captured at the Battle of Poitiers by the English Prince of Wales, the famed Black Prince. The King of France became a prisoner. France had no monarch. Its king sat in English chains. Its nobles squabbled. Its peasants starved. And over it all, the plague still lingered. The crown tried to govern through regents. Royal decrees still bore seals, but few obeyed. Local lords enforced their own laws. Cities turned inward. In Paris, a man named Etienne Marcel led a merchant uprising, demanding reform and royal accountability. He wore the colors of the city, not the crown. In the countryside, revolt simmered. Known as the Jacquerie, a peasant uprising erupted in Aube 1358, not just from hunger, but from betrayal. The people saw nobles retreat to castles while they buried the dead. They heard priests speak of divine punishment while watching bishops dine behind guarded gates. The revolt was crushed brutally, villages burned, leaders executed. But the fear in the ruling class remained. The crown, once feared and revered, now clung to power with trembling fingers. Even after King John was ransomed and returned in 1360, his authority never truly recovered. His ransom had cost the nation dearly. New taxes were levied. Trade remained broken. Trust, once lost, did not return. And under it all, in ditches, under churches, behind barns, the dead remained. No royal order reburied the plague pits. No monuments marked their names. The court, draped in silk and etiquette, moved on. But the people did not forget. France's monarchy survived. But it was changed. The idea of divine kingship, that the ruler was chosen by God and shielded by fate, had been pierced. The king had fled. The king had fallen. The king had been ransomed. The people had buried their own, while the crown sold privileges. In the decades that followed, France would continue to fight England, continue to crown and bury kings. But beneath the surface, the memory of the plague smoldered, a memory of abandonment. And the corpse, it turns out, left more than decay. It left questions. If the king could not save his people, who could? If the church could not stop death, who would? And if those answers never came, what might rise in their place? Germany was not a country in the 14th century. It was a mosaic of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and feudal territories. The Holy Roman Empire in name, but in reality, a fractured web of competing powers. When the Black Death arrived, there was no single monarch to rally the realm, no unified system to respond. What followed was not a coordinated defense, but chaos. The plague crept in from the west. It crossed the Rhine, likely from Strasbourg and Basel, carried by merchants, soldiers, refugees. In towns like Freiburg, Mainz, and Cologne, the first deaths were met with confusion, then fear, then fury. And because there was no central authority, each city dealt with the crisis in its own way, some with panic, some with superstition, others with violence. Many turned to God. Churches filled, then emptied as priests began to die. In Nuremberg, mass prayers were held daily. In Augsburg, bishops led processions through the streets, holding relics aloft. But the plague did not slow. Instead, it moved faster, from town to town, as trade continued, and no one could stop it. In some cities, local councils attempted quarantine. Gates were closed. Outsiders refused entry. But the plague was already inside. The walls that once protected from sieges did nothing to stop fleas and breath. The medical response was inconsistent. In wealthy towns like Lübeck and Regensburg, physicians tried treatments passed down from Arabic texts, herbs, bloodletting, poultices. In rural areas, people turned to folk healers or fled to monasteries. Nowhere did the death stop. In some towns, a third of the population died. In others, half. Few were wiped out entirely, left to rot in silence. The chaos was not only medical, it was political. Without a strong emperor, Charles IV would not be crowned until 1355. Local rulers acted as kings in miniature. Some taxed heavily to fund relief. Others fled their posts. Some tried to blame the crisis on witches or heretics, and many, too many, pointed their fingers at the Jews. Germany became the epicenter of the worst pogroms in plague-stricken Europe. In Strasbourg, before the plague even reached the city, Jews were burned en masse. In Mainz, the entire Jewish quarter was massacred. In Erfurt, they were herded into synagogues and set aflame. The violence spread not by plague, but by rumor, that the Jews had poisoned wells, conspired with the devil, or brought judgment upon the land. These massacres were not always spontaneous. In many cases, city councils approved them. Some even offered the homes and businesses of the murdered to Christian citizens as reward. In a time without centralized justice, hate became policy. But the plague did not discriminate. It killed Christian and Jew alike, noble and peasant, bishop and beggar, As the bodies piled, so did the instability. In many towns, the governing elite died. Vacuums formed. Power passed to new hands, often merchants or guild leaders who had survived by chance. The social order shifted. Old alliances broke. Some towns declared temporary independence from their lords. Others fell into feuds, their leaders blaming each other for failures of preparation. The economy collapsed. Mines closed. Salt routes broke. Wine exports from the Rhineland ceased. Grain rotted in silos. In cities like Bremen and Würzburg, coins were hoarded, but food was priceless. Entire currencies lost value as trade froze and the dead overwhelmed the living. Yet amidst the disorder, something else began to take shape. With so many dead, laborers gained value. Peasants, once bound to land, began to move more freely. Towns offered incentives to draw survivors. Skilled workers demanded higher wages. Apprentices opened shops of their own. The rigid feudal pyramid, emperor, noble, vassal, peasant, began to bend. In the absence of imperial cohesion, towns looked inward and outward. Some joined alliances for mutual defense and trade. The Hanseatic League, centered in the north, expanded its influence, connecting Lübeck, Hamburg, and other port cities in a network of commerce that would outlast the plague. Cultural life, too, transformed. Art turned macabre. Carvings of skeletal figures, dance of death murals, and plague saints appeared in churches. Literature darkened. Sermons warned not of earthly sin, but of the sudden arbitrary end that could come without confession. In monasteries, scribes noted that entire generations of monks had vanished, but they kept writing. In towns where universities had shuttered, young scholars traveled to safer cities and brought new ideas with them. Knowledge, like disease, spread. Still, the fragmentation endured. Germany would not unify for centuries, but the plague had planted seeds, not of unity, but of resilience, self-reliance, local strength, a distrust of distant rulers, and a deep bond with the town, the market, the guild. By 1353, the worst of the plague had passed, but its aftershocks continued. Some cities recovered quickly, others never did. Forests grew where fields once fed thousands. Churches stood abandoned, their bells rusted, their altars dusted with ash. The Holy Roman Empire survived in name. But in the minds of many Germans, the idea of empire had died. In its place rose something messier, more local, and perhaps more enduring. In a land ruled by many lords and few certainties, the people of Germany did what they had always done. They endured. When the bells stopped ringing and the carts stopped rolling, Europe emerged not as it had been, but as something altered, thinner, quieter, cracked. The Black Death had not only taken lives, it had dismantled economies. And in the ruins of those systems, something new began to stir. Before the plague, Europe's economic engine was vast but fragile. Its structure relied on layers of obligation, serfs to lords, lords to kings, kings to God. Labor was abundant and cheap. Land was concentrated. Wealth trickled upward. The cities bustled, but most of the wealth sat in the hands of a few: nobles, clergy, guild masters. The plague fractured all of it. With up to half of Europe's population dead, labor was suddenly scarce. This single fact rewrote the laws of value. Land was still land, but without people to till it, it produced nothing. Cattle died in fields. Grain withered. Mills stood silent. For the first time in generations, peasants had power. Lords, desperate. To salvage harvests and income, offered wages where once they had only offered duty. Serfs who had been bound to their lords by custom and law now found themselves bargaining. Entire villages were empty. Those who survived could choose where to go. Many moved, others stayed, but demanded better terms. It was a shift not just of economy, but of identity. In England, the government tried to resist. The Ordinance of Laborers in 1349 and the Statute of Laborers in 1351 attempted to cap wages and restrict movement. But laws on parchment could not resurrect the dead. Peasants ignored the edicts. Lords, too desperate to care, broke the law themselves to secure workers. Across Europe, similar tensions brewed. In France, laborers demanded coin instead of food. In Italy, city-states saw workers demanding entrance to previously restricted guilds. In the Low Countries, women stepped into roles left vacant. Bakers, weavers, even moneylenders. Inflation rose. So did opportunity. For some, it was ruin. Nobles with vast estates and no tenants went bankrupt. Monasteries lost their lay brothers and income. The church, already weakened by its inability to stop the plague, found its economic grip slipping as parishes fell into disrepair. But others saw the reset as a door flung open. In towns and cities, enterprising survivors seized the moment. Abandoned workshops were reopened. Houses were bought at a fraction of their former value. The urban middle class, merchants, craftsmen, lawyers began to rise. Markets shifted. Fewer mouths to feed meant a surplus of food in some areas. Grain prices dropped. Meat became more common in diets once dominated by bread. In England, sheep farming expanded rapidly. Wool, lighter, transportable, profitable, became a pillar of the post-plague economy. Land changed hands. Many nobles, faced with debts and declining revenue, sold off portions of their holdings. Wealthy merchants and successful peasants bought them. In some regions, this marked the beginning of a slow democratization of land ownership. Not universal, not equal, but different. Coins circulated faster. Towns minted new currency. Credit systems expanded. Banking families like the Medicis of Florence began their ascent, filling the vacuum left by old money lost to death. And trade routes, though bruised, adapted. Ports reopened. Caravans moved again. But the trauma of the plague altered how people thought about risk. Some merchants diversified. Others banded together in early insurance schemes. In Venice and Genoa, contracts became more precise, more legalistic, a way to manage the uncertainty that now haunted every deal. One of the most surprising beneficiaries of the economic reset was the printed word, or rather, the written one. With labor more expensive, records became more valuable. Who owned what? Who owed what? What land had changed hands? Notaries, scribes, and clerks found themselves in high demand. The seeds of bureaucracy were planted in the soil of survival. Education shifted as well. With fewer students and teachers, universities contracted, but their importance grew. A degree in law, in medicine, in theology was now a key to upward mobility. And because old traditions had failed to protect society, new ideas began to take root in these institutions. Rationalism, empiricism, questioning authority. This was no golden age, not yet, but the foundations were laid. Art reflected the shift. In the decades after the plague, scenes of everyday life appeared more frequently in manuscripts and paintings. Merchants, tailors, bakers, not just saints and kings, took their place in the visual story of Europe. Wealth had begun to find new patrons. The memory of death lingered, but the world had tilted. It is easy to see catastrophe as an end, but for those who lived through the Black Death, it was also, strangely, cruelly, a beginning, a clearing, a reset, and for some, a chance. Not all took it, not all could. The scars were real, families gone, churches empty, villages never rebuilt. But from the ash, new roots pushed through. The old economy had collapsed, and in its place, piece by uneven piece, a new one was being built. For centuries, the rhythm of Europe had been fixed. The lords held land. The peasants worked it, and between them lay serfdom, a contract etched in custom, not choice. Serfs were bound to their manners, to their lords, to the soil itself. They could not leave without permission. They owed labor, grain, obedience. In return, they received protection from war, from famine, from the wilderness that lay beyond. Then came the Black Death. It tore through villages, swept across fields, filled graveyards with those who had once bowed their heads and paid their dues. But when the silence settled and the dead were counted or left uncounted, something had changed. The contract was broken. The old rhythm faltered. There were simply not enough peasants left to keep the land alive. Lords, once accustomed to easy command, now faced desperate choices. Fields went unplowed. Mills sat idle. Herds wandered unattended. The labor that had once been cheap and endless was now precious and missing. At first, the response was denial. Across Europe, rulers passed laws trying to freeze the old world in place. In England, the Statute of Laborers of 1351 attempted to lock wages at pre-plague levels. Serfs who left their manors without permission were to be arrested. Wages above a fixed rate were forbidden. In France, similar ordinances were issued. So too in the Holy Roman Empire. But laws written on parchment could not undo the grave. Serfs began to move, some with permission, others without. Whole families abandoned their manors, walking to nearby towns where labor was wanted, even welcomed. Lords eager to retain their workers began offering freedom, sometimes formal manumission, other times informal arrangements, higher wages, fixed rents instead of labor, promises of better treatment. The manorial system began to dissolve, not with revolution, but with erosion. In England, this erosion was met with resistance. The landed elite, seeing their power slip, doubled down. They pushed for stricter enforcement, sent sheriffs after runaway laborers, demanded harsher punishments. But the more they squeezed, the more the peasants pushed back. By 1381, the pressure exploded into the peasants' revolt, a mass uprising that swept through the south of England, driven by anger over taxation, injustice, and the refusal of the ruling class to acknowledge the new reality. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed, the message was clear. The world before the plague could not return. Serfdom did not vanish overnight, but it began to crumble. One manor, one contract, one reluctant concession at a time. In some regions, particularly Eastern Europe, serfdom would linger or even harden. But in Western Europe, especially in England and parts of France and the Low Countries, it faded. By the early 15th century, more peasants held land as tenants rather than serfs. They paid rent in coin, not labor. They negotiated terms. Some grew prosperous, purchasing more land, hiring others to work it. A rural middle class, small but growing, emerged from the bones of the manorial world, and with freedom came migration. Former serfs moved to towns, learned trades, joined guilds, sent their sons to schools, even universities. The strict wall between noble and commoner began to blur. Not collapse, but blur. It would take centuries for that blurring to lead to rights, to revolutions, to democracy. But it began here, in the wake of pestilence, in the vacuum left by death. Lords, too, adapted. Some abandoned their feudal roles and became landlords in the capitalist sense, leasing land for fixed incomes, investing in wool or trade. Others married into merchant families. Nobility itself began to absorb the logic of the market. The economy shifted accordingly. With fewer mouths to feed, food prices fell. With higher wages, purchasing power rose. Markets expanded. Local fairs grew. Coins changed hands more often. The bonds of obligation gave way to the logic of transaction. Even the language changed. In England, the term villain once used for unfree peasants, fell out of use. Tenant replaced it. In France, legal documents began recording rural workers as libres, free. Church records, too, reflected the change. Where once priests noted dues owed to the manor, they now recorded tithes from independent smallholders. Culturally, the shift rippled through art and literature. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written just decades after the plague, The Pilgrim, the cast includes not just knights and priests, but merchants, millers, reeves, and wives of means. It is a portrait of a society in flux, one where the old hierarchies still exist, but new voices rise beside them. The end of serfdom was not a single event. It was a slow, uneven unraveling, accelerated by disaster, driven by necessity, and sealed by the quiet decisions of thousands who chose not to return to the way things had been. The plague did not free the peasants with a proclamation. It freed them by scarcity, by survival, and in that strange equation, fewer people, more value. Labor became something new, not just obligation, but leverage. When the plague passed, it did not vanish. It lingered in the minds of those who lived, in the way they walked, prayed, married, and dreamed. But nowhere did it leave a deeper imprint than in art. The Black Death did not only bury bodies, it exhumed obsession with death, with time, with meaning. Before the plague, European art had been orderly, sacred, hierarchical. Christ sat enthroned. Mary glowed in gold leaf. Saints held their attributes like badges. Death appeared, but only as a quiet reminder. A skull at the corner of a page, a figure in the background. After the plague, Death stepped forward. He danced. The dance macabre, the dance of death, emerged in murals, manuscripts, altarpieces, in cloisters and graveyards and the walls of churches. Skeletal figure, or sometimes many, leading a procession of people from all walks of life: pope, king, knight, merchant, peasant, child. None were spared. All were equal in the arms of the grave. In Basel, a grand mural wrapped around the churchyard wall. In Lubeck, it stretched across the cemetery cloister. In Paris, it appeared in poetry, a mocking verse recited by schoolboys and monks alike. Even in small villages, woodcuts depicted death playing a fiddle while the living danced. Unwilling but bound. This was not morbid curiosity. It was reckoning. People had watched neighbors die overnight, had buried children without rites, had seen priests weep and nobles beg. The world's order had collapsed. Art tried to make sense of it, or at least give it form. And so, death was not hidden. It was painted, sculpted, sung. Manuscripts brimmed with new marginalia, grinning skeletons, corpses embracing the living, worms devouring judges. Artists illustrated the stages of decomposition: bloated, blackened, rotted. It was no longer allegory. It was memory. Yet amidst this darkness, there was also beauty. The art of the post-plague world did not only record horror, it reinvented detail. The human figure became more expressive, faces more individualized, clothing more precise. Painters began to observe, truly observe, the world around them. Giotto, just before the plague, had begun this shift. After the plague, his influence deepened. In Florence, the painters who survived, Orcana, later Masaccio, added weight to their subjects: volume, sorrow. The Madonna no longer floated. She grieved. The saints no longer smiled. They mourned. In manuscript illumination, a new realism crept in. Trees bore correct leaves. Animals showed expression. Cities looked like cities. It was as if the brush itself had aged, had seen too much, and now painted not what should be, but what was. This realism would evolve decades later into the Renaissance, but it began here, in the shadow of mass death. in the hands of those who had survived. Architecture changed as well. Gothic cathedrals already rising before the plague paused mid-construction. Some were never finished, but those that were completed after 1350 bore marks of mourning. Carvings became more grotesque, gargoyles more twisted. Windows depicted not just saints, but scenes of Last Judgment, plagues of Egypt, and grim reminders of mortality. In music, too, the tone shifted. Sacred chants grew slower, more meditative. Composers like Guillaume de Machaut, who lived through the plague, wrote both haunting laments and intricate secular ballads, as if grappling with a world where God and grief now shared the stage. The obsession with time deepened. Clocks, once rare and decorative, spread through cities. Towns installed clock towers with mechanical figures. Some danced, others struck bells. In Prague and Strasbourg, astronomical clocks emerged, measuring not just hours, but the movements of planets. Time had become a presence, a thing to watch, to mark, to fear. People wrote wills with urgency, not just the wealthy, everyone, bakers, tailors, midwives. Testamentary culture exploded. Death was not an if, but a when. And art reflected that certainty. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of post-plague art was its honesty. It did not flinch. A fresco in Pisa, The Triumph of Death, shows nobles relaxing in a garden as corpses spill from coffins nearby. In another corner, hermits live in the wilderness, untouched by the decay of cities. The message was not subtle. Death spares no one. Only detachment, spiritual or otherwise, offers peace. These images were not merely reminders, they were tools. They taught, they warned. They reminded a scarred society that beneath the robes, the crowns, the armor, we are all dust. But even within the bones, there was meaning. The dance of death was not only grim, it was defiant. To dance was to move, to resist stillness, to accept death not with silence, but with motion, with art, with rhythm. To say, we see you, death, but we will not cower. And so Europe, though bruised, began to dream again. Artists kept painting. Poets kept writing. Builders resumed their scaffolding. And the people, still haunted, still healing, stepped cautiously into a world reborn. The plague had ended lives, but it had also ended illusions. What followed was not despair, but clarity. And in that clarity they danced. The plague took lives, but in doing so, it also cracked open the mind. When the Black Death retreated, it did not leave Europe as it found it. The wounds it carved into flesh had healed with scars, but the wounds it left on thought, on faith, on the sense of what the world was and could be, those scars ran deeper. They did not fade. They transformed. In the decades that followed, something began to shift beneath the surface of European life. Quietly, unevenly. Not yet a revolution, but an awakening. It began with memory. The survivors remembered what the church could not stop. They remembered the priests who died or fled. They remembered the empty altars, the locked sanctuaries, the mass graves sprinkled with lime instead of prayer. And though they still believed, for belief was stitched into every rite of birth, marriage, death, that belief was no longer blind. Doubt had crept in, and with doubt came questions. In universities that reopened slowly, in Paris, in Bologna, in Oxford, scholars began to reread old texts with fresh eyes. Not just scripture, but Aristotle, Galen, Cicero. The works of pagan thinkers long buried under theological certainty. And with the rediscovery of classical thought came a rediscovery of the self. What was man? What was knowledge? What did it mean? To observe, to question, to think? Humanism, the intellectual backbone of the Renaissance, did not erupt from nowhere. It germinated in the silence that followed the bells, in the halls where teachers and students had died, in the libraries that remained standing while cities crumbled. Petrarch, the poet and scholar who lived through the plague years, wrote of death with intimacy. But he also wrote of glory, of virtue, of fame. His letters to the dead, to Cicero, to Livy, imagined history as a conversation, not a tomb. And in that idea was a spark. If the past could be conversed with, then the present could be shaped. Art followed thought. The body, once depicted in sacred stiffness, began to bend, to breathe. Painters like Masaccio in Florence and Jan van Eyck in Flanders rendered humans not as icons, but as beings, with muscle, with sorrow, with depth. Anatomy mattered, expression mattered, perspective, the mathematical illusion of depth, returned from classical whispers to living technique. In plague-scarred Florence, the Medici family rose, bankers and patrons who saw in the ruin not an end, but a beginning. They funded artists, architects, philosophers. Their wealth, built on trade and opportunity, shaped the skyline and the mindscape of the city. Brunelleschi's dome crowned Florence not just as an architectural marvel, but as a symbol that man could lift stone toward the heavens, not merely wait for salvation to descend. The church still held power, but it no longer held monopoly over imagination. Literature changed too. In England, Chaucer wrote of pilgrims, of merchants, of lust and laughter, stories rooted in the living, not just the sacred. In Italy, Boccaccio's Decameron framed its tales around plague survivors, 10 young people escaping death by telling stories. In doing so, he preserved a generation's voice, not through saints and martyrs, but through wit, fear, and desire. This was not an abandonment of faith. It was a rebalancing. The Renaissance did not burn churches. It walked beside them, but with eyes open. Education shifted from monasteries to civic institutions. Latin remained the language of learning, but the vernacular, Italian, English, German, began to carry weight. People wanted knowledge in their own tongues. Printing, still decades away, would soon make that possible. The obsession with death did not vanish, but it evolved. The dance of death became reflection, not terror. Timepieces, once luxuries, adorned public squares. Calendars were recalibrated. Astronomy advanced, not to chart omens, but to measure and predict. Man began to see himself not as a passive soul awaiting judgment, but as a creature of reason, fallible, mortal, yes, but capable of understanding. And that shift, that tiny tilt in worldview, would echo for centuries. In medicine, it led to the study of disease not as punishment, but as process. Dissections increased. Universities introduced anatomy. Surgeons took notes. In politics, it planted the seed of civic responsibility, that a city should care for its people, not just control them. That order was not only divine, but practical. Hospitals, orphanages, public fountains, all expanded in the post-plague world. Even in economics, the plague's shadow reshaped thought. Wealth was no longer seen purely as inheritance, but as achievement. Banking became a profession, not a sin. Contracts replaced vows. Risk became a calculation. Capitalism, in its infancy, was born not in abundance, but in aftermath. And all of it, the art, the thought, the systems, echoed back to one event. The plague had made the world strange. In that strangeness, Europe looked inward and saw not only death, but potential. The Renaissance did not emerge despite the Black Death. It emerged because of it, not immediately, not universally, but undeniably. From the ash of loss came clarity. From the silence of death came questions. And from those questions came a world where man did not wait for fate, but imagined, painted, sculpted, measured, built, and dared. The minds that survived the plague would not forget it, but neither would they be ruled by it. So now, my dear listener, the fire has burned low. You've followed the path of plague across continents and cathedrals, through palaces and peasants' huts. You've heard the silence of cities emptied, the groan of carts carrying the dead, the desperate whispers of those who searched for meaning in the midst of collapse. And now, here we are, at the edge of the story. Or rather, at the moment when story becomes echo. Because the Black Death did not end when the death toll slowed. It did not end with a final breath or the closing of a city gate. No, it ended or began again in the minds of the survivors, in how they remembered, in how they rebuilt, in how they chose to live. You see, when something so vast, so cruel, so consuming touches every corner of life, it does not simply pass. It changes the blueprint. It rewrites the logic. It forces a reckoning not only with mortality, but with identity. Who are we when all the old structures fall? What remains when the world forgets how to be what it was? The people of the 14th century had no easy answers, but they responded, not only with grief, but with adaptation. They planted again. They wrote wills and stories and songs. They danced, sometimes with joy, sometimes in defiance. They built new hospitals, new schools, new homes. They left behind the towns too full of ghosts and started fresh in places unnamed. They painted death, yes, but they also painted the Madonna holding her child with weary eyes and kings kneeling not in majesty, but in humility. The sacred had become human. The human had become sacred, and that, perhaps, is what the plague truly revealed. Not just how fragile we are, but how malleable. History often marks the Black Death as a tragedy, and it was. But it was also a turning, a hinge in time, from the Middle Ages to something else. Not modernity, not yet, but the idea of it. A world where the divine shared space with reason, where the village shared space with the city, where memory shared space with invention. The people who buried there, children who watched their priests die, who felt their futures vanish in a single cough, those people did not vanish. They transformed, slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably. And from their transformation came the roots of our world. The skepticism that fuels science, the humanism that shapes education, the capitalism that drives markets, the bureaucracy that organizes states. Even the art that now hangs in museums, once painted in workshops that stood beside plague pits. They didn't know they were beginning something new. They only knew they had survived something old. So they lived differently, more cautiously, more creatively, sometimes more fearfully, sometimes more freely. And now, centuries later, we are their echo. Their questions remain ours. What is life for? What does it mean to die well? What is a just society? What do we owe the living? What do we owe the dead? Perhaps that is why we still tell these stories. Not because we need to be reminded that death comes, we already know that, but because we need to remember that after death, something comes next. A song, a wall rebuilt, a hand reaching for another, a story whispered by firelight. And so, before I leave you for the night, before the embers die and the room returns to silence, I leave you with this. The plague did not destroy the world, it revealed it. It held a mirror to our nature and dared us to look. Some turned away, but others looked long enough to see that what matters is not how we perish, but how we persist. Good night, dear listener. Rest well, and remember, even in darkness there is always someone, somewhere, still telling the story.